impractical to me and seemed way too complicated to serve as a guide for the clients that I was seeing with. Shortly after that, I started working with young offenders and socially excluded kids in schools in South London. And these clients were, I found it hard to relate Heidegger and Jean-Paul Sartre to the work that I was doing with them. And I read the writings of Pierre Hadot and became immediately struck by the way that he catalogued spiritual exercises in ancient philosophy, the most prominent tradition in that regard being Stoicism. And I thought, I was surprised he didn't draw parallels between those spiritual exercises and psychological exercises. And I asked myself where we would find similar things in modern psychotherapy, and I realized it was mainly in CBT. So I jumped ship from existentialism and psychoanalysis to Stoicism and CBT pretty early on. And I must have made the right decision because that's what I'm still doing.
Okay, the second one is a question for people who may be newer in the audience to Stoicism. What do you think are some of the most common misconceptions about Stoicism out there? And how do you respond to them? Maybe pick one or two.
Well, probably the main misconception is that the word Stoicism has come to refer to an emotional coping style or maybe a personality trait that has to do with suppressing or concealing unpleasant or embarrassing emotions. So we call it having a stiff upper lip. So that's a kind of caricature of what Stoic philosophy means. And actually, it's the crudest possible emotional coping style. It's essentially a form of emotional avoidance. There's a large body of research that shows that this type of Stoicism, which we usually write with a lowercase s, having a stiff upper lip, is generally not good for your mental health long term. So it's something that we usually discourage people from doing in the psychotherapy field. And so the most common misconception is that people confuse that unemotional coping style, or lowercase Stoicism, with the Greek philosophy, or capital S Stoicism. And capital S Stoicism, as you know, is the inspiration for modern cognitive behavioral therapy, which there are many hundreds of studies supporting the efficacy of in treating common problems. So lowercase Stoicism we know is bad for your mental health. Capital S Stoicism we know is related to CBT, which is good for your mental health. And so you really wouldn't want to confuse those two things. But the internet is awash with people who confuse those two things. For example, Andrew Tate would be a good example of somebody who says that he's into Stoicism and says he's a fan of Marcus Aurelius, but is really into these kind of crude stiff upper lip kind of coping strategies, which generally don't work out well for people. So I'd say that's the main misconception about it. I mean, other misconceptions about Stoicism, I think, I feel like one of them is that people, I think, view Stoicism as something that's kind of standalone, whereas I see it as being embedded in the philosophical tradition and very much drawing on earlier philosophers, particularly Xenophon and Plato's Socratic dialogues, but other bits of Greek philosophy as well, obviously Heraclitus, Pythagoreanism, and stuff like that. So I think people tend to see Stoicism as kind of a little bit too isolated, and they'd understand it more and they get more out of it, I think, if they saw it as part of a broader philosophical tradition.
So from misconceptions to what it can do for you, what are some of the most important lessons you've learned from practicing Stoicism, as I know that you do? Or are there any best practical exercises just off the cuff that you could recommend?
Yeah, why would anybody want to do Stoicism? What's Stoicism going to do for you? And the first thing I'd say is that it's hard to give a comprehensive answer to that question. The first book I wrote on Stoicism, I tried to list all of the practical strategies that I found in the Stoic literature, and I produced a list of about 18 separate psychological strategies, right? So first thing is there's more than can be summed up. So I'm going to give you a cherry-picked selection of things that I think might be useful. For me, there's a little story here, I guess. When I first started talking about Stoicism, I mainly talked at psychotherapy conferences and wrote articles for magazines and journals aimed at therapists. My first book was actually aimed at psychotherapists to read. And, you know, they would say, well, a lot of these ideas in Stoicism have parallels in modern CBT, but there was one that didn't. And I thought, well, then if this isn't something we commonly do in psychotherapy, that the ancient Stoics really did seem really into, you know, is it because it's not a good idea or it doesn't kind of appeal to people? So I got a surprise. And the technique I'm talking about is the one that Pierre Hadot calls the view from above. And now, if you're around, you can probably find modern psychotherapy books that refer to something a little bit like that. It's not a common technique in modern psychotherapy, but it's really surprising that it wouldn't be, because it's easy to turn it into a script. You can do an audio recording to turn it into a guided meditation, for example. It's a very appealing idea. It occurs beyond Stoicism and many other forms of ancient literature and poetry, as well as in philosophy. It's almost a recurring theme or a perennial philosophy. You know, we find references to it throughout the history of Western literature. And so I started guiding classrooms full of psychotherapists through the view from above, where there are different versions of it. One is just to visualize yourself floating up into the sky and looking down on events from high above it, and thinking about your current situation within a wider context of space and time. And then I kind of, first couple of times I did it, I kind of waited with bated breath to see what my classroom of psychologists and life coaches and psychotherapists would have to say about it. And they all immediately loved it. And they said, really, this isn't something that therapists do already? Like, it seems like an obvious thing to do with clients. It has obvious benefits. It introduces a broader perspective for problem solving. It tends to reduce the intensity of anxiety and other strong emotions, or anger, for example. It seems like an obviously useful technique. So that was a strange find, in a way, a strange discovery. And I think that's an important technique from Stoicism. If I was going to say personally what I found useful, it's really the Stoic ethics. I think early on in life gave me a sense of direction that I was lacking. And I think that's important today. There are many young people in particular, I'm tempted to say especially young men, who seem desperate to find self-improvement advice online, often from social media influencers that are giving them advice that really sounds shockingly similar to the sophists in Plato's dialogues, particularly Callicles and Thrasymachus, who have a quite an aggressive philosophy of life that's surprisingly similar to some of the stuff that gets fed to young people today. And I think in some ways that's not a very healthy philosophy. Stoicism, I think, offers a much healthier set of values. So the Stoic emphasis on virtue ethics, on character traits, seems very important to me, and potentially something we know now that work on values is particularly useful in treating clinical depression, for example. And so I think identifying the values that you would most admire in other people, or the character traits you most admire in other people, and then exploring what the consequences would be of replicating those values in your own life, is something that has a more subtle, more nuanced technique, but something that can help people with depression and generally give them a much stronger sense of direction in life and improve their emotional resilience.
Okay, now a question from an audience member. How can Stoicism help, in particular, with one of the common symptoms of anxiety, for example, which is rumination, going over the same thought patterns over and over again? Can Stoicism help with rumination?
Probably. I mean, what we can say with confidence is that Stoicism, so you can view Stoicism in a sense as acting as a kind of amplifier for evidence-based techniques, as a kind of clinician or someone with the background as a clinician, that's the way I would tend to approach it. So my first protocol would be, what does the clinical evidence say about treating anxiety disorders? And then I say, can Stoicism help with that? Can it amplify stuff that we already know? So, and Stoicism is pretty good on this. So what you're talking about, ruminative thinking and anxiety, is basically worrying. We tend to say it's a type of thinking that's common, particularly in generalized anxiety disorder, but also in other types of anxiety. Everyone does it to some extent. It's where you go round and round things in your mind, usually in a verbal way, asking questions. The questions that people ask are pretty formulaic. They're usually things like, what if something catastrophic happens? What if this happens? What if that happens? Like Chicken Little. You know, what if this happens? But what if that happens? And then usually, how am I going to cope with it? What am I going to do? How am I going to deal with it? Like, so questioning your coping ability. And usually those questions aren't answered. They just go round and round and round, kind of churning. And often, in many cases, it will keep people awake at night. So it can be associated with incipient insomnia. So worrying about stuff. And there's other types of ruminative thinking, but that's the type most associated with anxiety. And we know that it's one of the main things that maintains anxiety. I should say, I'm going to do a little deep dive, but I'll try and do it really quickly. Like, I think it's very important in psychology to distinguish between automatic thoughts and voluntary thoughts. And confusing those two things is central to many psychological problems, particularly in anxieties. People don't normally make a clear distinction. When people are worrying or ruminating, there's usually an automatic thought that starts off the chain, but then it's maintained by a lot of voluntary thinking, like a conversation that you have going in your head. And people tend to feel that rumination is uncontrollable. They can't do anything about it. And it's true that they can't control the initial automatic thoughts that pop into their mind, not directly, not easily, but they do have more control than they realize over how they respond and whether they continue the conversation in their mind, to cut a long story short. So people have more control than they realize. What did the Stoics say about this? Well, two things. First of all, I believe that the Stoics understood one of the most important and nuanced ideas in modern psychology, which is the idea of cognitive distancing or verbal diffusion. I think the Stoics basically had that idea. So when you're ruminating, it's very important that you're able to step out of your train of thought and learn to view it almost as if you're observing someone else having those thoughts. Or I would say almost as if you're stepping to one side and observing yourself having those thoughts. We call that cognitive distancing. So you don't have tunnel vision. You're not like hypnotized by your own thoughts, like entangled with them, but you're able to get a little bit of detachment and see how you're engaging in those thoughts, watch the activity unfolding. And so the Stoics are aware of that. And I think that's fundamental to interrupting ruminative thinking. And then the other thing that's associated with that is Epictetus gives some very good advice to students in general, which would apply here, which resembles what we call postponement strategies in cognitive therapy. So Epictetus says when you're in the grip of a passion, particularly if it's very strong, and a ruminative thinking would be a form of passion, Epictetus says that you should postpone responding to it until your emotions have naturally abated. Like, so you should pause, like, and say, I'll come back to this later. And we call that worry postponement today. It's one of the most commonly used strategies in treating ruminative thinking in general. There were studies early on that showed that college students who did this following a very simple postponement strategy found roughly 50% reduction in the frequency, intensity, and duration of worrying episodes or ruminative episodes. So that's used very commonly for clients that have that kind of problem. You have to notice that you're beginning to ruminate. You have to be able to kind of step out of it and view it from a detached way. You have to accept the thoughts rather than trying to suppress them or fight against them. But then you have to say, I'm going to do nothing in response to this. I'll come back to this later and think about it, say when I've calmed down or I'm feeling more relaxed. So I'm going to choose when I'll think about this topic rather than it hijacking my thinking in this way. And that seems to be a very powerful technique that the Stoics were aware of.
Thanks, Donald. Let's move from practice to Marcus Aurelius, who you've just written a second book on. The first one, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, has been out, I think, since 2019. But this one is a philosophical biography. So what are one or two of the most interesting facts about Marcus, which you've discovered in the course of your research?
Gosh, that's a good bit. Like you missed one. I wrote a graphic novel as well, so I've written 3 books in a row.
Yeah, there's also a graphic novel 3. Wow.
I've written 3 books in a row about the same guy. And I edited an edition of Meditations, and I've written some chapters for books about him. So I've kind of done so much stuff on Marcus Aurelius. I'm now in the middle of writing a book about Socrates, so I get a bit of a break from Marcus Aurelius. So I did learn a lot. I went to Carnuntum, where Marcus is stationed during the Marcomannic Wars, and I've interviewed the head of archaeology there and stuff. I mean, here's a real bit of this is super nerdy, but I spoke to the head of archaeology at Carnuntum, and I said, have you guys found anything in the ground that ties archaeology to the life of Marcus Aurelius? And what they found was a grave stele of a Praetorian guard dated 171 AD. Now, the Praetorian guards were probably only there if the emperor was there. They were his like personal regiment or bodyguard. So he says this pretty much proves that Marcus Aurelius must have been here in that specific year. And Marcus says in the Meditations that he's writing part of it at Carnuntum. So that tangible archaeological evidence is like gold dust, to historians. It allows us to kind of actually date something and tie something concrete in with something that we're told in a text. So that was kind of exciting in a nerdy way. There's so many weird things about Marcus Aurelius that are probably, might be surprising to people. Marcus led a dance troupe. He seems to have been really into it. You'll find references in the Meditations to his hobbies, his background. He talks in the Meditations about boxing and wrestling. He, like many Roman youths, he was really into boxing and wrestling as a young man. He was trained to fight in armor. It's kind of unusual in a way because he hadn't seen military service until he was forced to lead the armies on the northern frontier. So the stuff I might speculate about, I think it's likely that he was initiated into the mysteries of the cult of Mithras. We've got the evidence there is kind of pretty sketchy, although there is some. I think we know that Antoninus Pius was initiated and that Commodus was initiated. And there's some sketchier evidence regarding Marcus. There's actually an inscription that's damaged, and there's a debate about how to interpret it, but in some other bits and pieces. But I think it's likely that he was. There are a number of. It was a very popular cult among the army, and Marcus, where he was stationed at Carnuntum, there are a large number of shrines to Mithras that we know were in that area. So I think there might be references in Marcus's life and in Meditations to Mithras. And I think there are references to the Eleusinian Mysteries as well. We know that Marcus made a pledge at the height of the war that he was going to Athens one day, and he wanted to be initiated into the cult of Eleusis outside of Athens. So we know that was really important to him. And he went there. And it's reported multiple times in Roman history, so it seems like it was viewed as a big deal. I think in the Meditations we can see some references to the symbolism, like ears of corn and things like that, and natural processes of birth and death in the Meditations that probably come from Stoicism, but overlap with the symbolism of the Eleusinian Mysteries. That's some trivia about Marcus. Another thing that I think is underappreciated about Marcus is that Marcus spent more time as Caesar than he did as emperor, which was unusual. So he served as Caesar for 23 years. I think he was emperor for 19 years or something. So he had an extremely long apprenticeship under Antoninus Pius. But the role of Roman emperor is a composite of different titles and powers. And Marcus was the first person to appoint a co-emperor explicitly, Lucius Verus. As soon as Marcus took power, he immediately appointed a co-emperor. But Marcus himself had virtually been co-emperor to Antoninus Pius. A lot of people don't realize that, but for I think it was around about over a decade before Marcus became emperor, he had imperium, so command of the military. He had the tribunician power, which meant that he could control veto motions in the Senate, and as well as the title Caesar. So he was really almost like an emperor. He was almost a co-emperor to Antoninus. And so when we look at the role of Antoninus, we can probably learn things about Marcus's values and his role as emperor. His role overlaps with Antoninus's in a sense. And the other thing is, in terms of the historical sources, I mean, I think very simply, people that aren't familiar with Marcus probably just, I know there are people that think we don't know anything about him. They assume that we only have the Meditations. And actually, we know more about Marcus Aurelius than we do perhaps about any other ancient philosopher. Certainly we know more about him than we do about any Stoic, because he was a big deal. There are many statues of him. We have several surviving Roman histories of his life. We have a pretty extensive cache of his private letters. We have copies of speeches that he allegedly gave. We have many references to him in passing and other texts. We have other archaeological and numismatic evidence about his reign. And we also have a record of his legal rescripts. So we can make inferences about his political values from his legal agenda. So just as an aside, there's a lot more that we know about Marcus, I think, than people realize.
So a dancer, a Caesar, an initiate. What can we learn outside of the Meditations, do you think, as people interested in Stoicism about any kind of one or more episodes in Marcus's life? Are there any particular episodes, do you think, that might really crystallize his Stoic philosophy in his life as against in the Meditations?
I think you have, in a way, you have to look closely to find them. There are definitely little fleeting ones. So Marcus, there's weird stuff in Marcus's letters. He talks at one point about how he was going to get into his bed one day and he found a scorpion in it. And he tells a story to Fronto, his rhetoric teacher. And Fronto says, well, I wasn't worried for you because I knew that your philosophy would help you keep calm in a situation like that, almost kind of slightly glib about it. It's a really odd little conversation to see them having. But really the big one, the biggie here, and it requires a little bit of interpretation. It's not kind of nice, clean example in a way, but Cassius Dio reports a speech, speeches in Roman histories are notoriously unreliable, and in ancient history in general, they're often made up, right? So we know that they're among the least reliable parts. However, this was supposedly a famous speech, which Marcus gave to the army and wrote down and sent to the Senate. And so it was maybe published at the time. So there's some reason to think the gist of it might be reliable. The Roman historians generally don't seem to know that much about Stoicism. They seem to know that Marcus was famous as a philosopher, and they imply that they know he was a Stoic. I think he was famous as a Stoic in his lifetime. I think if we look closely, that seems fairly clear. But generally, they're not interested in that side of his life. They're more interested in his military campaigns and his legislation and so on. But the speech that he gave in response to the civil war that he faced is I think the strongest example of Stoicism influencing his life. Because to cut a long story short, what he does in that speech is pardon everybody, which seems quite remarkable in a way. It's not unprecedented in Roman history, but it seems like a striking example of Stoicism, and the way that he frames it seems to be influenced by Stoicism. So he says, these guys have instigated the civil war against me. And the implication, by the way, is they're threatening to kill. There were threats that he and his son Commodus, who was a teenager at the time, would be executed. They'd have to be. And his whole family were being threatened by this, as well as the empire being torn apart. And he says, the first thing that I want to do, he actually says he would step down as emperor and appear before a Senate hearing voluntarily to hear out his critics and defend his position against them. But he didn't have an opportunity to do it because they'd instigated a civil war. That's a remarkable thing. Can you imagine a US president offering to voluntarily step down and appear in front of a Senate hearing to defend himself against his main critics or opponents? So he suggests that he would do that in this remarkable speech. And then he says he pardons everybody involved. And arguably that led to a relatively bloodless end to the war, because Avidius Cassius's senior officers beheaded him. And I guess they thought, we don't want to be dragged into this. And, if we end this now, Marcus Aurelius is going to pardon us. Now, the really interesting thing about that is, a Roman general or an emperor may have said that, and nobody, in some cases, you might not believe him. But they believed Marcus Aurelius because of the kind of guy he was, to put it bluntly, which I think is a real testimony to his character. He said, I'm going to pardon everybody involved in this uprising. And they were like, we believe him. And so they got rid of the guy that led it. And surrendered. And Marcus was as good as his word. And he even protected the family of Avidius Cassius from persecution afterwards. So that is an interesting, someone could write a good article, I guess, analysing the influence of Stoicism on that incident, on that speech in particular.
Thanks, Don. I've got a couple more questions, but I think at this moment, given that I think we've got 15 minutes in this session, I'd like to invite questions from the floor, and in the absence of those, I'll ask mine. But we've got a roving mic. So if people would like to ask any questions while we have Donald with us, please make that known to Judy. Presuming, of course, the tech is going to work. Or else maybe people could even come up. People could even come up if they're brave enough. I did see a hand up the back, and I've got one there. But why don't you just people come up and maybe we'll just go through this process. We're very good with technology down under, Don.
I know, I'm impressed.
Montreal, mate.
Thanks, Donald, for coming all over and presenting. So I've been reading a bit about, and there are two words, ataraxia and apatheia. And a lot of English translations and modern day writers have written both of them as equanimity. However, it seems that the devil's in the details, where ataraxia is more around imperturbability or vice versa. So what's your take on that? How would you differentiate the two?
I'm not an expert on ancient Greek, actually. I speak more modern Greek badly with the Scottish accent, by the way. So, I'm conscious of some of the linguistic issues. It's kind of fascinating, right? Apatheia is a word that fascinates me because, in a sense, if pathos can also mean suffering as well as passion or emotion, the Stoics use it to refer to pathological emotions, basically. So apatheia would be the state of somebody, the state of mind or the condition of somebody who has freed themselves from pathological emotions. That's literally what it means. Now, the Stoics also use the word therapia. So they explicitly refer to the idea of psychological therapy. I mean, other philosophical traditions in the ancient world do as well. But the Stoics wrote books on it. Chrysippus had a book called On Therapeutics, which is lost today, although we have a book by Galen that refers back to it. Now, I see these two things as closely connected. Apatheia, to me, is clearly a word that captures the goal of psychotherapy. It literally means having transcended or liberated yourself from pathological emotions. It's what therapy is all about. And I think the Stoics, to some extent, understood it that way as well. It's part of the philosophy, but it's also a therapeutic goal. Ataraxia is more of a figurative expression. It means not disturbed would be the best translation of it. It means not kind of shaken up, I think, would be a more literal. So it refers to being free from disturbance, such as pain or anxiety. Now, the Stoics do use that term, but I think it's more associated with Epicureanism. And thereby, there's a problem. Now, I'll sidestep here. I'll say something indirectly. When modern Stoicism started, we assumed that modern Epicureanism would start, but it never did. And I thought it would. I made a mistake about that. In retrospect, I think there are several reasons why Epicureanism didn't take off. And one is that it would never have the backing of the majority of modern evidence-based psychotherapists, for the simple reason that the goal of Epicureanism is very similar to something that we tend to warn clients against in modern therapy. So if the goal is ataraxia or eliminating disturbance, that's a red flag. Like it's alarm bells ringing for psychotherapists, because that's what clients talk like when they come into therapy. The goal of eliminating pain, suffering, and distress is one of the main things that maintains those problems, because some of those feelings are involuntary or they're triggered externally, and they're not under our direct control. And so the only way that you could eliminate pain and discomfort that's triggered by society or external events would be through avoidance. And that's, the Epicureans lived arguably a very contrasting life from the Stoics. In the ancient world, they were seen as advocating very different philosophies of life in practice. So Epicurus lived in relative seclusion in a private garden outside of Athens. It supposedly said live in obscurity over the door, whereas the Stoics did philosophy in the middle of the agora, like in a shopping mall, in the marketplace, among out in public in the hubbub of Athenian life, and they engaged actively in politics. So the Stoics went out and faced and maybe even sought out disturbance, stress, pain, discomfort. They had a high tolerance for those things, where the Epicureans exhibit an intolerance for unpleasant and painful emotions. And now in modern psychotherapy, we absolutely would side with the Stoics on that, because Epicureanism, this idea of avoiding these things through withdrawal, is a much cruder and more simplistic way of understanding how to achieve equanimity. And it usually doesn't work out well for people in the long term. It can be counterproductive, because if you try to cope with stress by minimizing it or avoiding it, in the long term, you potentially further sensitize yourself to it. You become weaker as a result of avoiding stress. And I think the Stoics realized that. They thought in order to develop psychological resilience, you have to expose yourself to disturbance rather than avoiding it. But what you can do is take more control over your response to it. And I think that's what apatheia refers to. So I think there's a crucial psychological difference between those two terms. Although, if I remember rightly, some authors do use them as interchangeably. So I think Epictetus, from what I can recall, perhaps uses those terms interchangeably, but sometimes they're used to refer to different ideas about the nature of equanimity. Two competing concepts of equanimity. That's how I would see it.
Thanks, Donald. My question is sort of harks back to what you were talking about, particularly dealing with things like anxiety and sort of Stoic-based techniques from that. I don't know if you have much experience of dealing with children, but I wonder if you have any thinking around how we as adults can use our Stoic practice to help the children in our lives who maybe can't engage with some of the ideas in quite as academic a way. I'm thinking sort of primary school students rather than sort of high schoolers.
I worked for about a year and a half in a youth project when I was a young guy starting off in therapy, and I worked in I worked with young offenders, and I worked in schools, mainly with 14 and 15-year-olds. And I have a daughter, but I haven't worked a lot with small children. However, I have an article actually that talks about this that might be useful. It pulls together a lot of resources. Books. There are a surprising number of books for children about Socrates, about Diogenes, and even about Stoicism. For older kids, my graphic novel might appeal to them, but it's a bit PG. But for young kids, there's books even for very small children. There's a series called Little Stoics. So there's one called The Stoic Cat and the Stock Horse or something like that. With beautiful painted illustrations in it for little kids. But, you know, the main advice I'm going to give you approaches this from a completely different angle. And I would say, and this is true of Stoicism in general, the Stoics believed that the best way to teach people was through modeling behavior rather than, I mean, this is a misconception we have about Stoicism, because all the Stoics are dead and we just have their writings, right? So that leaves us with the impression that, you learn Stoicism by reading books. Well, you did to some extent in the ancient world, but you can see Seneca very explicitly saying, and Epictetus as well, that you'll mainly learn how to be a Stoic by hanging out with people who are Stoics or at least exhibit similar qualities. Marcus Aurelius absolutely studied Antoninus Pius and Junius Rusticus, all about modeling character traits and behavior from other people, basically. So as a parent, you, rather than lecturing your kids, for example, it's more about demonstrating the qualities that you want them to emulate. Now, there's a problem here, but there's also a solution. So the problem here, so this is cool, right? So the problem with modeling Stoicism, it's more about your thinking and attitudes, but your kids can't see that. It's in your head, it's invisible, right? They just hear what comes out of your mouth and see what you do with your arms and legs and your face, right? So there's a problem. There's a barrier to modeling attitudes and values, because the kids don't really know what's going on between your ears unless you tell them. And so the easiest way to do it is, rather than lecturing them, is to do what's called the think aloud strategy, right? Psychologists have studied this since the 1970s. So you say you're faced with a stressful situation, like you get a flat tire or something, or you're kind of running late, and your kid can kind of see that you're stressing and stuff. Now, in our society, we don't normally talk to ourselves, right? Or think aloud, but little kids do. That's normal to them. So if you give a running commentary or just think out loud and say, oh no, how are we going to deal with this? I'm really worried about being late. I need to just take a deep breath and calm down. It's not the end of the world. Let me just take it one step at a time. And this is the think aloud strategy. So taking what's going on in your mind, your coping, and making it audible to your kids, so they can not only see how you cope, but they're able to listen in on the thought process that are allowing you to cope better by applying Stoicism to problems that you face in real life.
Donald, we've got 3 more questions and 4 more minutes. So what I'm going to suggest is that the 3 people
rapid fire.
Rapid fire. They're going to ask all 3 questions, and then you're in a virtuoso performance. You're going to answer all 3 in one go.
Give yes, no answers. Yeah.
Well, this will be difficult. I'm Courtney. I just wanted to say, enjoying your book on the philosophy of CBT. So thank you very much. But you gave a really good description of some of the CBT interventions that might be inspired from Stoicism. I guess my question would be around, because you were saying Stoicism might sort of supercharge the use of CBT or kind of boost it. But I'm curious about how Stoicism has a much broader worldview, and in itself kind of offers a complete cognitive restructuring along very radically different views that modern societies often have about things. And obviously then it's functioning as a kind of critique of common opinion and appearances. So yeah, I think I just wondered what your views were about Stoicism as a standalone and how it brings that worldview that shapes the kind of practices and interventions that CBT could then use.
Well, maybe this might shock people in a way, or maybe it won't.
Donald,
I think
remember, there's 3 questions coming your way.
I was just going to ask mine because I think it's actually related to that one as well. And by the way, Donald, hi, you liked my review of this on Goodreads, so we're basically already friends.
Okay. Well, thanks for the review.
I was just wondering, do you think that Stoicism is perhaps like a legitimate alternative for making psychotherapies accessible to communities that, or individuals that aren't able to access psychotherapy or like can't afford it, that sort of thing?
Right. Yep. That's a good question. We have one more question, do we? Well, I'm going to answer them all.
I'll try to respect your request for keeping it short. I've been listening to your book, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, end to end on Audible for at least 10 times. And I found it incredibly useful. The question I want to ask is, you cover a lot of specific things: how to speak wisely, how to follow your values, how to desire, how to tolerate pain. Why didn't you get into how to overcome depression? Did you break it down? Did you decide to break it down a different way, or what was the reason?
Okay, I'm going to try and answer all three of those questions at once in 1 minute. I think there is if I remember rightly, there's a section in that book about loss and sadness, which would be very relevant to depression. Also, all of the stuff about values in How to Think Roman Emperor would be very directly related to how we treat depression today. In terms of Stoicism as an alternative to CBT, my bias, I suppose, is I don't see it that way. I see Stoicism as something that, if we are using it for mental health or psychological well-being today, 99% we pretty much have to build on what research says. It would be crazy not to. The Stoics don't give us enough in that regard. But could we reach a wider audience? Yeah, absolutely. You didn't ask me about another obvious benefit of Stoicism in that regard, which is that CBT works for long-term resilience building, but the research tends to show that it has to have booster sessions. It only works for like a year or 2 years or so, and then you need to refresh it. The great hope for Stoicism would be that it's sticky or permanent. So if you can give people resilience training when they're kids or young adults, and it stays with them for the rest of their life, that would be like the holy grail of mental health. And so if Stoicism could amplify CBT and other evidence-based techniques by giving a framework that makes it a lifelong philosophy of life, almost like a religion or something, like when people get into Buddhism and they stay into it, like that would be gold dust, basically. I hope that answers all three questions to some extent.
Awesome, Donald. Thank you so much. And thank you for your time, obviously, throughout this morning. Can I ask people to join me in expressing our gratitude?
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me, Matt. And, thanks to everybody else involved. Like, technical glitch